my computer. Okay. There we go. All right. So officially, my name is Benjamin Solitaire with the Civic Engagement Commission. Welcome to tonight's workshop. I'm going to hand it off to Chris Walters from ANHD. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Chris, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for joining tonight. Great to be here. So as Ben said, we'll be talking today about what we call proactive planning and sort of how we can center equity and planning. I'll be sharing my screen. I'll be going through a presentation. Welcome questions as I'm going through, especially clarifying questions, but really any questions that folks have. You can raise your hand or drop it in the chat. I know Ben will help me if I'm missing anybody. I'm also sorry, you guys heard me. I think I just got muted, but you were with me. Great. I have this headset where I feel like I touch it with my elbow and then it gets. So I'm just going to drop in the chat before I start a link to a poll site. I'm going to be soliciting questions from you all throughout the evening so we can see people's responses. You could start there now with just what district, to make some of you repeat yourself, but what district you're representing. And I will pull up my presentation here. So again, thanks all. Tonight we'll be talking about the role and power of community boards in proactive planning. So you may have seen a description, but what we're envisioning with this training is that we're going to seek to provide community boards with the tools and approach to help broaden their review of land use proposals. We'll consider ways to move away from the reactive position boards typically find themselves in and towards proactive community planning that situates local needs within citywide needs, empowers community visions, and produces more equitable outcomes. So a bit of sort of a bigger picture discussion today, but we'll get into some details as well. And so to do that tonight, we'll do a quick introduction. I'll ask a few questions of you all to hear where you're all coming from. Then we'll talk about how the city currently plans, some of its limitations. We'll talk about what we're working towards with proactive planning, why we think now is especially the right moment. And then we'll dive into some approaches and resources for proactive planning. And then lastly, end with some reflections of the role that community boards can play. And again, hearing from you all throughout. So again, my name is Chris Walters. I'm the Senior Land Use Policy Associate with ANHD. We're the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. And our mission is to build community power to win affordable housing and thriving equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. We're a member organization, so our members are themselves community groups across New York City. Some of them are affordable housing developers. Some of them are grassroots organizing groups, tenants' rights, equitable economic development. And we use research, advocacy, and grassroots organizing to support our members in their work and to build equity and justice in their neighborhoods and citywide. And so again, I'd love to just ask a few questions of you all as we get started. If you go to the link that I dropped in the chat, you'll also see here as well, if folks prefer to text, you can text this Chris Walters 684 to this number to join. But would ask first folks to share what community board, what district you're all representing.
Community Board 14, Brooklyn.
Thanks, Florencia.
Community Board 4, Brooklyn.
Thanks to Shauna. And I'm seeing that folks are putting it in the link as well, which is great. Hopefully you can see my screen here. We've got someone from the Bronx tonight.
Brooklyn.
And folks can feel free to add to the link as well. I always think it's nice just to be able to see. Thank you. Okay, I'll move us on to our next question. Again, as we start sort of thinking this bigger picture, but I would ask, when you hear the word planning, what do you think of? Folks can just enter on that link, a word, a phrase, what you think of when you hear the word planning.
Being prepared.
Being prepared, yeah.
FYI, I don't think that it's updating the whole site to getting past the first question.
Thank you. I appreciate that because I see that this is not. Okay, let's give this. I think
Perfect.
this should be up now.
Yes,
Thank you. We're sort of trying this. Yeah, we're trying this. That was on me. Thanks for catching that. Yeah, folks are able to put that in. Please do, and we can see responses. So again, when you hear the word planning, what do you think of? Not happening in the city. Yeah. Zoning. Any other thoughts? And thanks. I see folks in the chat as well. Thinking ahead, proactive design, organizing a policy framework or project. How a city chooses to build infrastructure in response to population growth, possibilities, supporting growth, proactive.
For me, planning is how the needs and services of the community board are being met, and that's what planning should be. What to do to meet the community needs and services.
Thank you. You were a little muffled to me, but I think I heard about serving community needs. So thanks. I'll ask then one more question, and that is, when you hear the word zoning, what do you think of? And I'm activating this right now as well. I think I see in the chat rules. Again, feel free to drop it in the link if you have it there. Regulations of what can and can't be built in a particular area determines uses, lines, I'm seeing in the chat. Permits, variances. Goes where. Yeah, rules that are perhaps outdated as they haven't been significantly been revised in decades. See restrictions, I see control. Any final thoughts? Thanks. Oh, this is great. And I see a lot of sort of things that I think we'll touch upon in our discussion tonight. Limitations that contribute to the housing crisis. Yeah. Well, feel free to keep adding. I'm going to turn back to our training, and again, I'll be welcoming some questions like this throughout. So, sort of setting up those questions to begin to dive into, how the city currently plans, how it doesn't plan, and the ways in which zoning sort of largely stands in for planning. So again, sort of starting with big picture, but what is planning? And we would argue here at ANHD that planning is community building, that it's a process that provides a vision for a community. And so that can include things like spatial layout, so what types of things go where, what development looks like, things like height and density, how people move around, streets and open space, institutions, businesses, resources, and then crucially, we would argue that all of these should be based on needs and historical perspective. So are the things above being addressed in a way that advances racial and economic justice in terms of who is being served? And so, with all this in mind, what's the goal of planning? So ideally, the goal of planning is to further the welfare of community members by creating accessible, equitable, healthful environments. And again, this is why we would say that planning is community building. So, planning determines many of the conditions that structure our lives. So for example, whether or not our community has access to healthy food, to good hospitals, to affordable housing, whether our children's after-school programs, our community centers are fully funded, or sort of big infrastructure things where waste transfer stations, where highways are located. Planning helps determine the future. So again, these major developments, big infrastructure, train lines, parks, schools, new buildings, they're going to last a long time. Their impacts might not be felt right away, right? So we have to plan with this longer term view in mind. Excuse me. And then lastly, planning can be a process of community building, but it can also be a process of community destruction. And this starts to get into something I think we'll talk about through this training, but this question of public value versus private value, and also the question of what we mean by community, sort of the different scales and whose needs are being served. And acknowledging there's often a tension there. And again, that this is exactly where planning should come in. What are our guiding principles to help determine this, to help determine what is guiding us when there are a variety of different interests looking to be served. So, that's a very quick overview of what planning is about. And now quickly, what is zoning, which, in theory is a lot simpler. So zoning is about spatial layout, right? It's the rules that dictate uses and densities throughout the city. So where those uses can go, how dense they can be, and what the buildings they are in look like. As you likely know, there are 3 main zoning districts in New York City: residential, commercial, and manufacturing. Residential allows residential uses, and then some community facility, things like schools, doctors' offices, libraries, but not other uses. Commercial allows commercial uses, retail, offices, entertainment venues. Most commercial districts also allow housing, with some exceptions. And then manufacturing, industrial uses, which in most cases do not allow residential, but do allow quite a variety of commercial uses. And so again, we want to sort of hold up this idea of planning versus zoning, and emphasizing that planning is about more than just physical space, more than just the zoning rules. Again, about resources, about investments, about programs, about institutions, about how people move around, and about demographics and need. Again, it's really about putting forward a vision for a community, for our city. Now, zoning is a crucial piece of that, but again, it's a piece of planning. It should follow from planning. And that piece is about physical space, about what future development looks like. And again, the ideal is that zoning should be tied to a clear picture of a desirable future developed through good inclusive planning. So how does this actually work in the city? And I think sort of the spoiler, that in many ways planning does not work, right? How does the city plan? In many ways, they do not. I think we heard that in some of the comments you all shared earlier. There's no rigorous or regular planning cycle in New York City. So there's lots of plans, but there's no guiding framework or timeline for how these plans connect to each other and how they connect to land use decisions. So for one example, we have Plan NYC, which became One NYC under de Blasio. It's a charter mandated long-term sustainability plan. Again, under de Blasio, expanded to include more of a social equity focus, but still no guidance within this long-term sustainability plan, no guidance or transparency in how that plan should guide land use decisions. What we tend to have in the city then instead is a focus on rezonings, on piecemeal ad hoc rezonings to plan to address our land use needs in communities. So again, we have the ideal not matching the reality. So that zoning, the ideal being that zoning should be tied to a clear picture of a desirable future, The reality being that we have our zoning resolution and our zoning map, which guides development. I think as someone said in the comments as well, a zoning resolution and map that hasn't comprehensively been looked at since 1961. And then this resolution and map being changed at times through ad hoc neighborhood or site rezonings on no sort of regular schedule, just as proposals move forward, as applicants move proposals forward. And so, why does this matter, this focus on zoning over planning? Well, zoning is mostly about regulating private development. So from a legal standpoint, it's rooted in what's called the police power, the power to regulate private behavior and property, not in something like eminent domain. And so, in this way, it's really about regulating property that doesn't take it, that still allows for private profit to be extracted from it over time. And so in a sense, it's about saying, how are we controlling the things we don't have complete control over? And with that, then, with this focus on rezoning, it becomes much more transactional. It becomes much more, what's the best we can get out of this zoning change, rather than starting from a place of planning. What do our communities need, and how can we best get there? Zoning is also forward-looking. It's about what can happen next after zoning rules have been changed. Doesn't affect what's there already. And it then really lends itself to a pressure to facilitate an existing or a growing market. But again, the ideal is that zoning should follow a plan, a vision. It shouldn't just be to facilitate what's there already, or to say, you can't fight the market. Let's change the zoning to adapt to it. And then lastly, a lot tends to get left out, or let's say addressed in the wrong order when you lead with zoning. So capital commitments, especially with private rezonings, with site rezonings, you're very limited in how much you can address. You might get a development to widen the sidewalks in front of their building, but less likely you're going to be able to get a thorough redesign of a dangerous street by DOT. That would be something that takes planning. I will say on the flip side, I think the city likes to pair neighborhood rezonings with capital investments. But again, that's not necessarily the paradigm that has to exist. And again, good planning would look at neighborhood needs first, and then consider if zoning changes might be a part of addressing those comprehensive needs. And then lastly, along with this, equitable economic development and jobs and type of jobs tends to be something that gets addressed in the wrong order. See some comments in the chat, and I'm just going to see if there's any questions before. And yeah, thanks. And I see Benjamin's acknowledging this, but yeah, we will share this presentation when our series is over with y'all. So again, looking a bit then at the impacts of, we're sort of discussing this, getting a bit into, sorry, I want to make sure folks can hear me. I'm just seeing a message from my, Benjamin, give a shout if for some reason I've lost.
You went out a minute, but you're back, or you just had a
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry. I have a bit of a fussy headset. So looking at some of the impacts, again, of this sort of zoning first approach, and one of them is the uneven and inequitable housing development in our city. So looking at the left, you're seeing a map of housing units completed between 2010 and 2020. The darker the color, the more housing units have been completed. This is all housing units, market rate and affordable. And so you can see how certain neighborhoods, certain community districts have taken on the bulk of new housing in this time, and how this has been especially true in lower income communities of color in North and Central Brooklyn, parts of Western Queens, and Western Manhattan, and then the South Bronx. And then on the right, you're seeing affordable units completed between 2014 and 2020. And I think here you can see how the imbalance is even starker. Again, the darker the number, the more affordable housing units, but really showing how much of the city has not produced affordable units. And in this case, by affordable, I mean rent regulated units in some fashion. So units that have a regulation agreement to serve certain AMI levels, certain income bands. Thanks. I actually I'm just looking at the chat and seeing, but I maybe answered this question on affordable. Yeah, and so in this case, not naturally occurring affordable units, but just units that are tracked. And these can represent a range of affordability as well. This doesn't have that breakdown. So from low AMI to quite high. And so then another impact of this zoning first approach has been inequity in how and where rezonings and neighborhood rezonings especially have been used to increase density. So what we're looking at here is rezonings that were proposed, in some cases not all of them went through, but proposed under the de Blasio administration. They're the ones that you can see in a dashed line. And they're then overlaid with an analysis done by the Regional Plan Association of areas at high risk of displacement. So again, during the de Blasio years, we saw that neighborhood rezonings were almost entirely concentrated in low-income communities of color with high displacement risks. And there were a lot of rightful questions around whether these were the right types of neighborhoods to be adding what are mostly market rate new density. What is the planning rationale behind these neighborhoods undergoing neighborhood rezonings? And I'll give a quick sort of case study of that to dive a little deeper into what we mean. So the Jerome Avenue rezoning was a neighborhood rezoning in the South Bronx. It passed in 2018 or early 2019. And from our perspective, an example of the negatives of relying on zoning disconnected from a larger plan, and what I would think of as a typical de Blasio administration rezoning. So again, in a low-income neighborhood of color with a long history of redlining and disinvestment. And what the rezoning proposed was rezoning what was largely a stretched zone for auto uses and manufacturing into high-density residential. And the city's rationale, their public purpose, when you simplify it, was to create affordable housing. Again, the question is, why was this neighborhood chosen? Is this the right type of neighborhood for a neighborhood upzoning of this fashion? Is this the best way to serve its identified needs? And our members on the ground there felt very strongly that it was not. One, because it was an area that was already producing a high ratio of affordable to market rate housing, and a lot of then concern that by increasing the density, you risk changing the market, incentivizing more non-affordable production, and actually leading to a net loss of affordable units, both being produced and existing in the neighborhood. Again, then the sense that the neighborhood was forced to trade this new, mostly market rate density for long overdue capital investments, that MIH units were out of reach of the average resident. So the only guaranteed affordable units that would come with this rezoning wouldn't serve the typical resident. And you see that here with the graphic, which on the left shows the AMI levels for the neighborhood. Very large concentration of the neighborhood households making under 30% AMI, and then what units this rezoning might bring. And then lastly, that it came at the expense and displacement of auto shop businesses and workers who were primarily workers of color, primarily immigrant workers. So that's a sort of quick overview of planning versus zoning. I could pause for a moment if folks have questions, although I know folks are dropping them in the chat. And what we'll look at next is what we're working towards with the idea of proactive planning, and again, why we think now is the right moment. So again, sort of a slight overview here, but in our current paradigm, who gets to change zoning? In theory, according to the charter, in addition to the mayor, any taxpayer can submit a rezoning application, as well as any community board, any borough board, borough president, or the land use committee of the city council. But what you see in practice is that rezonings are proposed by the mayor via his agencies or by private developers. These are essentially the only taxpayers submitting zoning changes. And what we found is that when a community proposes a comprehensive plan, a community plan, it's often ignored or co-opted. And so what that means is the community is pretty much always put into a reactive position of responding to these rezoning proposals from the city and from private developers. And then lastly, when do they do this? When do they change zoning? Again, they do this whenever they want. There's no comprehensive or regular cycle. When zoning changes are considered, it is on a rolling ad hoc basis that neighborhood rezonings and private rezonings, site rezonings are moved forward. And so again, this is important because rezonings are, as I've said, zoning is about regulating private development, but rezonings are justified. They need to be justified by serving a public purpose. It's a requirement of a rezoning that they say, this is the public purpose by which we're asking this government action of changing the zoning. But without a defined meaning, without some sort of guiding plan, as we've been discussing, what this public purpose is can get pretty subjective. So for example, what we'll see is that the public purpose can be more affordable housing through mandatory inclusionary housing. Again, the public purpose could be even broader than that. It could be we are creating more housing, period. It doesn't matter what the AMI levels are, doesn't matter, that more of the building will be market rate or who those rents might be serving. And then likewise with jobs, this action will create jobs. Doesn't matter what those jobs might be, who they might be accessible to. And again, this matters because on the flip side, we know and see that rezonings typically produce or protect private benefits for individual developers and often for wealthier communities. So, through creating more market rate housing, or I think we saw this especially with the Bloomberg administration, with down zonings, with low density housing that tends to not allow for the creation of affordable housing. So again, what we're interested in is moving towards this better balance, really reclaiming the public value of rezonings, and really sort of taking up that missing space around planning. So moving towards proactive planning, encouraging communities to put forward their proactive community vision, using different tools, including but not limited to zoning, to advance equity and public benefit. So again, instead of plans and reports with no guidance or sort of action items, no direction tied to how this relates to zoning changes and to land use, we are moving towards plans and principles that provide this guidance that sort of stake out community priorities and community needs, and pulling them directly from community voices and from data that we'll look at shortly. So, before we continue, as folks are hopefully reflecting on this, I'd love to ask you all, how you as CB members determine whether a rezoning proposal sounds good for your neighborhood. And I'd welcome you all to go back to the link that I shared. And I'm gonna
put it back in the chat.
Yeah, I will drop that in the chat again, Ben. Thanks. Let me just make
You've
sure.
had a few people join.
So thank you. Yeah, and for new folks who have joined, you'll see a chat in the link. Let me make sure that this is that I've activated. It is now activated. So again, I'd ask you all, and if you're able to drop it in the link, that's great. How do you determine whether a rezoning proposal sounds good for your neighborhood or not? Yep, I see thinking about whether we're equitably contributing to the housing growth, look at density. Any other thoughts folks want to drop in there? What is it and what is its immediate and long-term effects on the community? Analyzing who will benefit the most, must be the community, determine the height allowance.
There's also a question in the chat. I don't know if that's her thought, but
Thanks, Ben. I will turn to that. And I'm very sorry, I seem to be having various technical difficulties today. I'm not sure why my webcam is off, but
yeah, I wasn't sure if you meant.
but yeah, no, I did not mean to, and I'm sorry, but I know you can, at least you can all still hear me and you can see the presentation. So I unfortunately have anyway, I hope that okay, well, let me turn back to my screen.
You have some little boxes on the screen for some reason.
Yeah, I think I need to leave, come back. I'm really sorry. I'm not sure why this is happening.
Yep.
My Zoom seems to be frozen. I'm glad you all can hear me. And I'm going to drop and come right back. I apologize.
We'll pause for 1 minute.
Okay, apologies, everybody.
Take a drink, get a drink of water or. It looks like you're still.
Okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm here. I couldn't quit, but it seemed like it's now at least working. I don't know if my camera will come back, but
You still see the poll where, oh, there we go. Good.
okay, I think we're back on the slides here.
We are back.
Okay, I'm not going to mess with my camera. I apologize, everybody, because I'm afraid that's going to just kind of mess us up. But let me before we continue. So yeah, I saw Teresa's. Isn't city planning responsible for the proper planning ahead? Yeah, thanks, Teresa. So I think what I will say how we feel at ANHD is that there is much more actual planning that they should be doing. So they, where I think we see them do most of their planning is in moving forward rezonings. And I think there's a feeling that there's often a step missing in terms of what came before the proposed rezoning. And I think that's especially true at sort of a citywide level of looking at citywide need and then sort of filtering that through local conditions, through displacement risk, through opportunity areas, and identifying, how this particular rezoning is moving that forward. So, we would charge us what they're supposed to be doing, and that it's something that they could be doing a lot better. And I think in part what we're talking about tonight is how communities and community boards can try to fill some of that space for elevating their local priorities and needs. And Florencia, I think that that's a place where, that's one way that community boards can help increase their power. I do think community boards have power and have a lot of power in at the least helping to elevate those priorities, helping to move decision makers, especially local council members, in that direction around land use issues. So just to go back a moment, right? So we were saying, why is now the time, we think, for proactive planning? I mean, I believe it's been the time for a while, but I think in this moment especially, we are seeing a lot of recognition from both the city and the state of the need for a more equitable distribution of housing. But we want to make sure that it is done in a way that really does center equity and that really does incorporate and honor community input and priorities. So as some of you may know, Governor Hochul has proposed her housing compact. This is being debated as we speak as part of the state budget. But what she's calling for is 800,000 units of new housing throughout New York State in the next 10 years. And what that would mean for New York City is minimum housing development targets by community district that these districts have to meet every 3 years. It encourages transit-oriented development near MTA rail stations, would look to legalize basement apartments and accessory dwelling units, and making commercial to residential conversions easier. And then Mayor Adams has proposed both his Get Stuff Built and his City of Yes, which is, again, a plan of building 500,000 new homes in New York City over the next decade, and in part speeding up environmental review, some land use proposals and building permit processes, and then updating, making some citywide zoning text amendments to change zoning regulations to allow a greater variety of housing types to be constructed and housing conversions to be made. So again, I think from both of them, a recognition of the need for a more equitable distribution, or let's say a wider ranging distribution of where housing is being built. But I think what we'd argue is missing from both is an actual equity framework, a goal of proactive comprehensive planning. How are you going to equitably distribute that density through the city, which again means acknowledging the differences between community districts in historic inequity, in displacement risk, in opportunity areas, in recognizing that you need to have targeted developments of different types of homes in different types of neighborhoods, and then incorporating some sort of standards for community involvement and really making sure that that they are not just sort of weighing in, but that they are helping to guide the actual outcomes. Before I continue, I see Teresa. An accessory dwelling unit means an additional unit on 1 or 2 family zoned housing. So it mostly in practice means legalizing basement units or allowing things like what's called granny flats, or a unit in a garage, a unit elsewhere on the lot. So it's a way of getting a little bit more housing in 1 and 2 family districts, and especially around legalizing and making basement apartments safe, which again, we know many of our neighbors, many New Yorkers live in basement apartments, and we know tragically with recent storms and people who have died with flooding that many of them are not safe. So again, that's why we think this moment is particularly right for pushing forward community visions for how we can address our citywide need, how we can address inequity. So again, what we're pushing for with proactive planning is to have this better balance of top down versus bottom up. So again, we've seen with top down, we mean rezonings, these state and city level strategies that are focused on supply side, on building housing quickly. What we at NHG think of as bottom up is community member, as council member and community org-led, community board-led plans, principles, and engagement that we would hope are centered on an equity framing, elevating community priorities, while making sure that we are serving citywide need. And so that's then the balance, where these two can meet. And again, about reclaiming and defining public value. So, we've seen why it can't just be top down. But, I think it also can't just be bottom up either. We need to make sure we're staying accountable to citywide needs, to our larger city community, and addressing them fairly and equitably. And so, how we envision that, and what we're starting to see from different council members and different actors in this, is putting forward what we call land use principles and centering community needs. So basically laying out a set of consistent principles and stances, both for sort of content and engagement, that are rooted in community priorities, backed up by both neighborhood groups and residents, and backed up by data. So things like, this is how these are our minimums for what we need for community engagement, but also then what I would call content. This is the housing need in our neighborhood. This is the type of housing, or let's say we need a minimum of a certain type of housing to serve that need. Here are investment priorities, and here is what we need to see with any proposal to understand that it's trying to address at least some of these issues. And I'll share some examples of this shortly. But the idea with this, again, is that by having these principles, by sort of doing this proactive planning, you have something to share upfront with the city, to share upfront with private developers. You're sending a message that this is where any plan being brought to us should start from. And it can then begin to change the paradigm of sort of backroom negotiations under the pressure of the ULURP clock. And again, can begin to set a proactive, a positive framing that's translatable across projects. I think in general, we hear from the city, I think they have a sense that all neighborhoods just say no, right? Everyone's going to say no to any proposal. I think by putting forward a proactive, a positive framing, you're able to say, here's our needs and here's what we want to say yes to. We are looking for planning. We are looking for proposals that recognize our needs and show us how they are speaking to them. And it's transparent, it's clear, it's something that sort of everybody sees from the beginning. And Elizabeth, thanks. I see your question before I move on. Yeah, opportunity areas, I would say would generally be, so if we think of areas at high risk of displacement, I think you can think of opportunity areas as the opposite end of that. So places with a lot of home ownership, with higher income, with access to transit, open space, with high performing schools. And again, trying to figure, as we talk about this equitable distribution of density of development, where can we do that that creates affordable housing where we're not seeing it today? And on the flip side, where can we remove displacement pressure? Where can we begin to develop without displacement pressure that make neighborhoods more accessible than they are today? Let me know if that, if that answers your question or if further. So, as I mentioned, we're starting to see, different actors move towards this idea of land use principles and guidelines. And, when we have a Q&A at the end, I'd love to hear what you all as community board members, the work that you all might be doing towards this. But so Speaker Adams, Adrienne Adams, recently put out her planning and land use guidelines and application toolkit, which includes key principles around some of these points I mentioned. So ways to elevate community engagement and address citywide needs. So include some specific principles on how to do that, things like language access and sort of timing of when you engage the community. Principles around fair housing and increasing affordability. So again, acknowledging the need for more equitable distribution, but also pointing towards ways to expand affordability under different projects. And then things like supporting equitable economic development with living wage jobs, with preserving industrial business zones and the good paying manufacturing jobs that exist in them. And so we've seen that from the speaker, and then we've seen that from some specific council members as well, that I call out again just as some examples of what principles can look like. So Councilmember Gutierrez in parts of Bushwick and East Williamsburg put out her land use policy either earlier this year or late last year. And one of her principles is to maximize deeply affordable housing at 50% AMI and below in order to create opportunities for those with the greatest need who have been increasingly displaced in District 34. And again, she backs this up with data, including pulling from the Equitable Economic Development Toolkit, which I will share with you all shortly, but that includes a map of displacement risk by neighborhood. We've also seen this from Councilmember Julie One in Queens, in Western Queens, Astoria and Long Island City. And one of her land use principles is around community investment. So calling that investments in public infrastructure should match the scale of the project. And essentially having a matrix around things like ADA accessibility, schools, parks, streets, transportation, and ensuring that that some of these key pieces are being addressed by any plan that is being brought before the district, brought before her. And again, being backed up by data, in this case from the community district profile, here showing the real lack of access to parks in her district. And then lastly, as an example, and as I think one sort of aspirationally to work towards, Councilmember Gutierrez has called for that all proposals in her district within Bushwick should follow the land use framework of the Bushwick Community Plan. So again, this was a community plan developed over many years in Bushwick that reached a place of consensus in what future zoning should look like in the neighborhood. This was a plan that was then not adopted by the Department of City Planning. But I raise it up because I think it points to a direction that community principles can move towards. And again, laying out sort of a clear vision for where you think new density might be appropriate. And I then think really arming the community for working with the city to address citywide need, but to say, here's our vision for how this can actually happen. So, I think, as an approach, how can you go about this? You want to think about your issue areas for the neighborhood, for the community district. So things like housing, like open space, like schools, like climate and sustainability. You want to ask questions about your community needs, about your community strengths, and you want to connect those to quantitative data. You want to connect those issue areas to data. So things like demographics and demographic change, housing availability, housing production, situating your community in the larger city community. How much new housing have you taken on already? Climate risk and quality of life. So again, this sort of gets into the opportunity area, but what does my community have access to, and how does it impact our well-being? And I can quickly, again, we will share this deck afterwards, but I can quickly walk you through some of these resources. There are a host of resources that are fairly easily accessible to pull data. I will use the example of Bushwick, but I'm sure many of you may know this, but Community District Profiles is a great place to get a snapshot view of data for a community district. So includes things like foreign-born population, includes the racial breakdown of a community. So here we see with Bushwick about 56% Hispanic, and then about 18% white, about 18% Black, non-Hispanic, and then a host of other things. And again, where they sort of fall within the community, rent burden, and poverty. But then you can take deeper looks and looks over time by going to, for example, the city's fairly new database, the Equitable Development Data Explorer. And here, again, I'll click on Bushwick. You know, as we saw with the community district profile, the racial breakdown, here you can see that over time. And so we can see in Bushwick how the Hispanic population, for example, has changed from 2000 to 2020 with a loss of about 16%. Within that same time period, the white non-Hispanic population has increased by about 145%. And you can look at a host of things with the EDI, with the Equitable Development Data Explorer. You can look at income. You know, here we can see the median household income is 53,000, and that about 40% of households make below 50% AMI. But again, you can break that out by race to look at disparities. So that median income of 50,000 becomes 40,000 when you look at the Hispanic population, and it becomes about 50% who are below 50% AMI. Again, this data that in part informs Councilmember Gutierrez's land use principles. When you look at that by the white non-Hispanic population, median household income up to over 92,000, and about 17% of that population making below 50% AMI. So again, just a few resources, and there are more shared in the deck that we'll share with you. All. And then, you know, lastly with this, you know, I think data is a great place to start, and an easier, sort of quicker place to start, but then ideally rounding this out with robust community engagement through a host of means, you know, through surveys and focus groups, through meetings, and through being very intentional in speaking with specific groups and specific within the community. And then again, sort of nearing the end here, but you know, then thinking just about how these principles can then be used in practice. I think sort of most tangibly for the paradigm we're in now, community principles can help in improving proposals that are brought before. So again, they can really serve as benchmarks, as something to measure proposals by through all steps of the process. Again, you can think of them as a public and consistent standard that you'll stick to in dealing with developers and in dealing with the city. And then again, to these earlier questions of the role of community boards, you know, they can really inform and strengthen, you know, the role you play in informing the city council members' ability to modify specific proposals. The community board obviously just has an advisory vote, but I think the stronger that the stronger your hand and the stronger and more consistent what you're pushing for, the stronger the council members' ability to push back and improve. And then just a quick example, when now Borough President Antonio Reynoso was a council member, he had a pretty clear and consistent principle around outside of the industrial business zone, which he was very adamant needed to stay manufacturing. He would only support M to R rezonings that provided more public value than mandatory inclusionary housing. This was in part because of the large amount of private profit that can be made from that type of rezoning, and because of the importance of M zones and the good paying industrial jobs that again are primarily a workforce of color, an immigrant workforce. And And so with this principle of no M to R without stronger than MIH, in a few specific rezonings that did propose this, he was able to move them to a very strong place. So 100% affordable housing and the expansion of existing industrial space with the Sidham Street rezoning, and then with 1601 DeKalb, a proposal that was originally an M to R with MIH, by the end was a 100% affordable housing development. I think as well that community principles can sort of lay the groundwork for more robust community plans, things like the Bushwick Community Plan, the Two Bridges Community Plan, which came out of the Chinatown Working Group Plan in the Lower East Side in Chinatown. And I'm going to just move through these. And as we wrap up here and then welcome some questions, I would ask you all another question again, which is, what is a word or phrase for a major land use principle you think your community needs? And I will drop this link back in the chat. And then I do see a comment in the chat too that we can address after. Let me switch my screen again here. So I've just activated that, but would welcome you all to chime in. With this idea of land use principles, what comes to mind for your community and your needs? I see space. This one I'm actually realizing is a word cloud, so it'll sort of it will expand as folks add more things in. Yeah, so I think we've seen a few spaces here. I see community input in the chat. Decarbonization, renter first. Homeless, shelters, green space, getting a little larger. Thank you, folks. Yes, I see parking got in there. See if there's more in the chat, more green space as well. Great, thank you all. This is interesting to see. You can feel free to continue adding things. This I will again share when you have the deck, but a few more resources here, and we'll include even more when we share. And again, a question I would ask of all of you, are there other resources that you suggest community members use or look at? I will turn back again and solicit this question in EB poll. But always great to learn what you all use and what you are all aware of, as there's all kinds of different things out there. And I'll take this minute to see, yeah, thanks, Leo. I'm seeing your note that the information and community profile site is a little out of date. And so you find in terms of when that data is pulled from.
Yeah, just looking at it, it seems that in some cases it's pulling from information like the census from 2000, and in other cases it's pulling information from like 2019.
Yeah,
So
thank
it'd
you for
be
that.
great
Yeah,
if,
Yeah.
as we look into some of these tools to make
Yeah.
to make decisions, if some of the information will be more up to date for the various districts,
yeah. No,
just to
that's a
see
great,
kind of where we are right now in terms of demographics and
yeah,
economics, crime, you name it.
yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, and that's something that you know, that here we're always sort of working to push the city for better and more up-to-date data. That is why I think the equitable economic development tool, which is something that came out of the racial impact study legislation that passed in 2021, is a great new tool that both tracks things over time and then lets you break things out by race. But these are great resources that folks are sharing. Thanks for the displacement alert portal shout out. Yes, Spatial Equity NYC, I think, is a fairly new site, which is very cool. Yeah, and then exactly reaching out to tenant associations. Anything else folks want to get in here? Otherwise, we'll sort of floodhelp.ny.org. That's great. I don't think I know that particular site. And Teresa, I see your question in the chat, which I think is a great one to sort of start with for a little discussion. So I will, I'll turn back one last time to the presentation here. And I don't think we need to put this one in EV, but you know, a question again is, you know, what role do you think community boards can play in proactive planning? And yeah, I would also like to you know, to maybe start as well with Teresa's question, you know, how do you make a community that cares only if it affects them directly? Do you want to expand on that at all, Teresa? I mean, I think that's a great question.
It's been my experience after many years on the community board. People only seem to come to a meeting and voice an opinion about a ULURP, a special permit, a variance, if it's their adjoining neighbor. If it's a block away, the attitude is, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get people to care
Yeah.
that it's their neighborhood?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I obviously don't have the cure-all answer, but I do, you know, I do think that's a piece of why we push for proactive planning, of saying, is there a way, you know, to create a space that is not about reacting, you know, and about sort of trying to bring folks together to say, you know, what is the vision that we want to that we have for this community, and how can we you know, how can we help move it forward? Now, it might be that the way to do that is in part to call on what they need to react to say, you know, Mayor Adams has his City of Yes plan, you know, Hochul has her housing compact. Now's the time for us to come together. But I think ideally, you know, and again, I know these things always get, you know, tricky then in how they play out, but it can take some of that energy of the reacting into that more positive space, and maybe get over a bit of the planning fatigue as well, that I think understandably happens everywhere, where it's like we're always responding, we're always having to, and again, trying to bring people together for that more proactive vision. You know, I understand. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's trying to change that paradigm a bit by putting that forward, and then, you know, hopefully then seeing some tangible results from it that might make it, you know, that again can sort of gather steam and keep it going.
I just want to, this is Benjamin, I just want to chime in. I saw Florencia's comment there. When I was working with City Council member Steve Levin down in who represented part of the Gowanus, and they were doing the Gowanus rezoning, there was a community coalition that was formed, the Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice, that was made up of many representatives from organizations and individuals, including Community Board 6, who fought for years for equitable development in that plan. And I think it was a great plan at the end. There's a lot to be left to do, but that was a way to make everybody care, was you sort of had to bring together a lot of different constituencies. But I also see that Suki has her hand up, or I think their hand up.
Hi, yeah, definitely, Teresa, I think we see that everywhere, that people don't react until it's in front of them. I do think people are starting to realize with traffic and parking issues that things that happen citywide can affect them. The same thing with public transportation systems that move throughout the city. The other thing is, like, for adjacent communities, we might shop in the next community over, or even, a couple of communities over. So people notice that kind of thing around retail corridors. So that's been my experience, but it's definitely challenging.
Does anybody else want to chime in or have a comment or question about what their board particularly is doing or should be doing?
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. I would just emphasize that too. I would love to hear, do folks, are folks taking, how do they feel they're taking, or are folks sort of taking an approach that is, that maybe aligns a bit with this?
I think that on our board, our land use community committee, they do take a proactive approach, and I would say I would say that, but we still there's more work to be done. So thank you.
No, thank you, Francois, and remind me where what board are you with?
14 Brooklyn.
Brooklyn 14, great.
I was going to shout out to Jane. You have your hand up. Jane, do you want to chime in? You're muted right now.
Sorry, trying to find the settings on my phone. I do agree that it is very challenging sometimes to get people to understand. And sometimes while, as was mentioned, people aren't always familiar with the exact area, the exact location. They haven't had the personal experience. So while sometimes we've had meetings where we're talking about just different things that, a committee may have to approve, we literally have taken out and looked through Google Earth and shown people where we're talking about, because that too can help to open up the dialogue and get people more apt to share. Because sometimes there'll be members who are at a committee meeting or public members who have come who have that direct relationship, and then others do not. And rather than put up that wall, we can use the technology to our advantage and help bring that understanding to everyone.
Definitely helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Jane.
When you can do that. I'm going to chime in again, if I may. Sorry to I don't want to preempt, but I know when again on the other end of the district, when I worked in the council district CV1, I know we have a couple of people here from there. We were working with the council office, was working with the land use committee to bring in more resources and to broaden their understanding of the bigger picture issues. And they were doing that as a voluntary thing. They understood that they needed to look at the big questions about economic development and equity and how the impacts are on the city. So I thought that was a great thing. I hope they've continued that. And you also didn't mention we have what isn't talked about much these days are the 197A plans, which are I believe charter allowed or charter encouraged, or in the charter, it's a city charter.
Mhm.
But I think there was a time when a lot of them were developed, and then, as you said, they got pushed aside.
Yeah, unfortunately, that has been, I think that has been the general experience. So, and
But
you're
maybe now's
exactly,
the time.
yeah, and no, I mean, that is an interesting thing that we think about. I mean, you're right that it's in the charter and it's sort of a process for putting forward a community plan. What unfortunately has tended to happen is that where they are enacted, they're sort of taken by DCP and then moved more in their direction, right? And often sort of beyond the vision that was put forward by the community. So I think, unfortunately, we haven't really seen one of those done since maybe 2010 or 2012. But I think, I think what we're suggesting here is a sort of lower, a lower lift way of starting to sort of stake those, stake those claims in a consistent fashion. But also, I think something, I mean, in general, right, like how can we build on that to, as you're saying, Ben, right, always be moving towards ideally these more robust community plans and finding the ways of actually enacting them, again, with the understanding, within this sort of larger equity framework that we're always trying to promote.
Melissa, I see a hand up. Is that right?
Thank you for all of this. This has been great. And
Yeah.
I wanted to thank Valencia too for on Community Board 14 in Brooklyn and on our Housing and Land Use Committee. So we've chosen to go an educational route as of late. We had Lucy Block from ADHD and
That's great.
Stephen Lysian, and we have some others on the docket as well, but Lucy was there to really actually to explain the displacement alert portal and just do a whole showing and basically just showing all of the open data that is out there and what people can find about our district or themselves for that matter. I think for myself personally, at least, one of the things that I find to be a little unique and challenging about our district, we cover Flatbush and down into Fitness Park, Kensington, a unique mix of like rent stabilized housing, but then also getting into homeowners and some very, very prized houses, I would say. Very, very nice properties, but just the diversity of opinions that can exist on a board like this when it comes to zonings and what should or should not be within a district. And I think in part it does come back to this question of how do you make a community care, but also how then do you see things from the other's perspective as well when it comes to renters and owners. And having worked at Fifth Avenue Committee and Neighbors Helping Neighbors and being part of all that Gowanus, everything, it's been interesting to just trying to bring it all together. I think I'll leave it at that, but this has all been great tonight. So
Yeah.
thank you for all of that.
No, and thank you, Melissa. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's the that is the crux of so many planning issues, right? Is the sort of balance of interests. And again, I think it's why we always see the approach needing that mix of, of a sense that the equity framing from the top and then, the community priorities and principles. Again, I don't really have to say top and bottom, but from the community, but, and then, saying, right, when there is that tension, what can help us to, you know, to navigate that, and how can we have a process that does hear all those voices and that, you know, makes them understand that they're being heard. And I guess just lastly, I do think, to your point on the data, that is where I think data can come in, you know, very handy as well, and sort of helping to tell a clear story that maybe does help, you know, does help to move some people. And on the flip side, you know, when the city or a developer is proposing something bad, that sort of speaks that language, the language that they're often coming in, right? Of like, oh, no, you're just, you know, saying your point, your opinion, you have no idea, and saying like, no, this is backed up in data. So that's why we always sort of push for the two to go hand in hand.
Anything else before we wrap up tonight? I think that seems about it. I will just, you can always chime in. I just want to say a couple things. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming tonight and caring about your districts and your communities and working so hard to make them better. It's I served on a community board just several years ago, and it's a great thing to do, and I had a lot of satisfaction, and hope you guys do too. The Civic Engagement Commission, we have one more of these, this topic next Wednesday. So if you want to encourage other people to join, you can share the registration links you have, or have somebody email me. I'll put my info in the chat. The Civic Engagement Commission also has citywide participatory budgeting coming up. We'll be voting citywide for the first time in May and June for borough-based and neighborhood-based projects, which is very exciting. So keep an eye out for that. We'll also be providing language interpretation services at poll sites during the primary election, early voting, and on voting day. So we'll try to share that with all the community boards. One of the missions of the CEC, as well as turning out voter turnout, or increasing voter turnout for that primary. And we'll also, a little later in trainings, we'll have I think I said before at the beginning, but housing preservation and developments workshops on affordable and fair housing in the city, and then also some parliamentary training workshops after that to help hopefully everybody's meetings run a little smoother. So but that's all coming up. We'll be sharing that information with their district managers and chairs. Again, thank you for coming. Chris, do you have anything else you want to say before we close out?
No, I mean, just the same. Thank you all. My apologies, my camera stopped working, but thanks for the great questions and engagement. As we said, you know, we'll share this presentation. We're doing 3 of these, so after Wednesday, we'll share this presentation, and that will include my contact info. I would welcome anyone, any board to reach out with questions or thoughts at any time. And thank you all.
Fantastic. All right, everybody, I will stop the recording, but have a great night. Thank you for joining us, and stay safe out there. We'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thanks,
Carol.
Benjamin and Chris.
Thank you. very much.
Thank you.